And again, we're excited to have Catherine join us. She's going to give a brief intro and then we'll dive in. Throughout the course of the meeting, if you have questions, feel free to put them in chat or feel free to just unmute, raise your hand, dive on in. Catherine will also have some pauses where you can, jump in with Q&A as well. But again, we're so excited to see you. It means a lot to have you continue to join us on these meetings. And we will be following up next month with a look at what's on the horizon for our 2025. I can't believe that 2025 is almost here, but our 2025 sessions. So looking forward to hearing from you all and seeing you all hopefully in the future again. But without further ado, I will hand it over to Catherine to get us started.
Thanks, Kristen. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I've been really looking forward to this session, this opportunity. I have such a love for the G2 program. I think it is absolutely a game-changing institute and organization within the industry. So you can tell I'm very excited to be here and really thinking about how can certainly we share with you some of the data, some of the insights that we've gleaned in our work with advisors. But also, as Kristen mentioned, hard to believe we are making hard turn into a new year. And so for each of you, as you're thinking about your own goals and objectives as you head into 2025, maybe we'll spark some ideas with you as well. For those of you who don't know me, I am head of practice management, as Kristen said here. We're a global practice management team here at Dimensional. We have offices around the world. And so we get to spend time with really interesting advisors and clients on a global scale, and including with the studies we run. We're going to focus our time today on the U.S. landscape in our time today. I've been with Dimensional, it'll be 7 years in January, and prior to that, spent a number of years both with an RIA in the Seattle area, where I was COO there for a handful of years, and then have been most recently been more focused on the consulting practice management side, including I'm spending some time with Fidelity's practice management organization, which I know we have some folks on the call today with Fidelity. I love that. I used to say that I've been in the industry for a little over 20 years, but my team has been gently reminding me that now I have to say almost 30 years. So I'm old. That's what that is. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as mentioned, we want to share with you some of the insights that we have gleaned from the global study that we run each year. I'm going to go ahead and let's click here. We get technology to work for us. All right, thumbs up. We can all see the PowerPoint. All right, love it. Thank you very much. And as Kristen mentioned, I will try to pause at a couple of spots and check in with any questions. We're going to move through a few different core topics in our time today, but certainly we'll be looking to absolutely do some Q&A at the very end as well too. So feel free to submit via chat, or as I mentioned, I'll pause and we can take a verbal hands up, if you will. We have been studying and measuring the advisor space, RIA space in particular, for what will be 14 years heading into next year. And the results I'm going to share with you today are from the 2024 study. We ran this study in end of first quarter, heading into second quarter of this year. The data is predominantly based around 2023. So just to kind of level set what we're looking at here today. And that's really going to be the focus of our time, and really wanting to share with you what we see happening in the data, how it has informed the work we've been doing with advisors. I often say to the team, the data gets us to the table, but it's really our work with advisors to help them think about seeing themselves in this data and what they can do to take action around it that is most meaningful. So I've already mentioned the Global Advisor Study, which you can see here. We had over 520 U.S. firms that did the study this year. I'm also going to touch just a little bit on our Global Investor Study, which is all about client engagement, client satisfaction. This is a white label study that advisors that we work with can access at any time and send a set of questions out to their clients to measure around a myriad of areas, including just what do they value the most, what do they look for the most in their relationship with advisors. And I'm really excited to say that we have cleared over 100,000 end clients in that study. So it definitely warms our data hearts here at Dimensional relative to what we've been able to capture and play back to the advisors that have used this tool. I'm going to touch on that a little bit, so I wanted you to know about that. But as we think about the Global Advisor Study, one of the lenses that we've applied over the last few years is this idea of a high-performing firm. And recognizing that while revenue growth is important, there are other levers in the business that need to be in play, we believe, for a true high-performing, sustainable business over time. And so that's what we've applied here. When we say high-performing firm, we are referring to a very specific criteria that looks at revenue growth, looks at client retention, employee retention as well. We're going to talk a little bit about what talent has been doing in the industry here over the last 12 months. We absolutely want to think about profit. For sure, even with our high-performing firms, they often will cite profitability as being an area that they are, I don't want to say concerned, maybe concerned, but definitely focusing on in the business. And then to the degree they're an organization that has multiple advisory teams or multiple advisors, that revenue per advisor number as well. We dump all the firms together, dump all the metrics together, and the top quartile are the high-performing firms. So I'm going to share with you today what we see these firms doing that looks a little different, may look a little different than what the other firms in our study are doing as well. I will call out before I move to the next slide that when it comes to client retention and employee retention, we did not, for lack of a better way to put it, we didn't hold it against the firms who told us that they stepped away from a client or that they chose to step away from an employee. We believe over time that those are healthy muscles in a business, that if you're willing to step away from a client that is no longer a client you can deliver the greatest value to or make sense for the business, and then the same thing with employees as well. Obviously, it's really great if you can get the right clients and employees in the door to begin with, but we certainly understand that the business can change and those needs of the organization can change as well. So we didn't hold that against these organizations, so to speak, if they told us that they chose to step away from both of those. So how did these firms do? So here's a quick breakdown of across those 5 criteria. So when it came to revenue growth, the high performing firms in our study clocked in, and the number is actually technically 14.4 year over year revenue median growth. All other numbers on this slide are average, but the revenue growth number is a median number to kind of smooth out the edges there. I will tell you that if you strip out M&A activity, that number goes from 14.4 to 13.6. So there was definitely a little bit of impact of M&A, but not as much as we maybe have seen in some prior years. But with that in mind, if you strip out market activity, market growth, if you will, and particularly for the other firms, which are in that smaller gray dot, you can see very quickly, in my opinion, where organic growth is absolutely a challenge for these organizations. I know it's something that Philip and I have talked about and something we're seeing in a lot of the firms that we work with. So we're going to unpack that a little bit more. Not surprisingly, really high client retention rate. And this is an example of where between the high-performing firms and the other firms in our study, we don't necessarily see a big difference per se. But if you're, a smaller organization, or if you lose a really big by in terms of revenue or complexity client, that's absolutely a hit. At a minimum, it's a distraction to the business, but it can absolutely be a hit to the business. So what are you doing today? What are these high-performing firms doing today to really deliver an exceptional client experience? And of course, we'll talk about a little bit of how to use that to then drive growth in the business. Employee retention rate, we did see a little bit more of a divergence between the high-performing and the other firms in our study. I'm going to share with you in a few moments some of the things that we saw in terms of why talent is moving around. We give you an EBOC number here. It's a number that is a little bit smoother around the edges, so to speak, but I do know that a number of you think about EBITDA, and I can tell you for the high-performing firms, their EBITDA was 40.4%, if you wanted to jot that down, versus the other firms in our study where EBITDA was 20.9%. So definitely a difference there on the EBITDA side. And then this revenue per senior advisor, I think, is a really important one. I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next slide. I promise you, this is one of only a few really data-intensive slides. So hopefully you're not staring at this on your phone. Hopefully you're looking at this on a reasonable monitor. But these numbers are important. These are the productivity, capacity, and profitability metrics that we have been capturing in our study for years. And of course, when we think about revenue per full-time equivalent, which is that very top number, we think about revenue per senior advisor as you go into that middle swim lane, assets per senior advisor, really important. And then of course, on a household level, we do start seeing some differences. I do want to pause. I failed to mention on the prior slide, one of the metrics or one of the criteria for high performing is that revenue per advisor. It's important to note that when we say in that criteria for that particular metric, advisor is both senior and service advisor in our study. The only difference between a senior advisor and a service advisor in our study is that the senior advisor has business development responsibilities. So they have to have the time, the capacity, and the skill set to be adding business to the organization while taking care of clients. But the acumen around advice and care for clients is the same. So this is just true firms who identified that true senior advisor and what they're doing within their business. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because we're not live in the room together, but usually when I ask if 140 households per senior advisor seems like a high number, most people put their hand in the air. So you can see it's actually a tick below the other firms in our study. That was a reverse from last year. Last year, the high performing firms were at a higher tick. So we're going to continue to monitor that. I'm going to share with you some ways that we believe these high-performing firms are able to handle a higher number of households within the organization over time. And then the last thing I'll call out to you is that household, that bottom swim lane. We absolutely do see over time that these high-performing firms are figuring out a path to the higher revenue clients. Usually that does translate, as you can see here, to larger clients, but really complexity is an important piece of this. The fees and pricing around these relationships is really important. We see with high-performing firms that they get very purposeful about what they're charging, how they're charging for the services and the value they deliver. Not in a, nickel and dime our clients kind of a way, but in a way that says, look, we are delivering value. We want to continue to deliver that value. And so how do we do that with regard to our fees and pricing? So we'll talk a little bit more, but you can see at 12.8, they're a little bit higher, if you will, on that revenue side than the other firms in our study. One of the long-standing questions that we ask each year are when you think of, and it's a pretty healthy laundry list, when you think about challenges in the business around growth and challenges in the business around operations, what do you see? And I'll go ahead and highlight here really quick. Capacity absolutely continues to be a challenge. I was just speaking actually with a UK firm last week, and this is an area that it's global in nature. And there's some different reasons for these capacity constraints. Some of it is just an organization that, whether through rapid growth or lack of attention, they don't necessarily have the systems and processes in place that are allowing them to scale, and it's really beginning to cramp. But for most of the organizations that I talk to, it's either they have more prospects than they can take on. I don't know many firms that would turn that problem away, but that is a problem nonetheless. Or they don't have enough people in the organization, enough advisory talent, for example, enough leadership talent to really help overcome some of those challenges. I'm going to share a little bit more on the capacity side. But this continues to be a challenge for, as you can see, even for the other firms in our study. And then on the operational side, it is absolutely about getting the right people. You saw really high retention rates on the employee side for really all of the firms in our study. But talent is moving around, and how you find, hire, retain, and develop those folks long term absolutely continues to be an area of focus. And for the high performing firms, they're really, really thinking about it. You can see developing employees is in there as well too. I keep threatening every year to take out implementing workflows because everybody picks that. and it's a real challenge. But I will say it's very rare for us to step into an organization these days that doesn't have a good technology or good tech stack, if you will. But it is this area of implementing workflows, really positioning the business for scale that we see a lot of the challenge. And at the end of the day, often workflow processes is not a technology challenge, it's a human capital challenge. And so happy to talk more about that if there's any interest. So these are the core challenges that these organizations identified. And you've heard me already talk about, as we talk about this capacity piece, here's a contributing factor that we see in our data. You are doing more for your clients than ever before. And we went back and looked. This is a longstanding question in our study. We wanted to understand what's been the evolution of services that you are delivering. And generally speaking, what percentage of clients are also getting access to those services, which is part of that question. Generally speaking, high-performing firms offer more services and a greater percentage of their clients take advantage of those services. And you can see there's been quite a growth. I'll go ahead and load the next slide here. There's been quite a growth in some of these services. Now, some of these you may feel like, well, these come up generally during the process of financial planning, and that could be the case. This is really where organizations are doing this for more than a couple of clients, right? They really are leaning in and delivering a lot more services. We do differentiate between tax planning and tax preparation. I cannot tell you on the M&A landscape how many calls I've had this year of firms that are either looking for an RA firm that has a tax entity or straight up going after a tax entity to add that to their business. So even on the M&A landscape, that is showing up as well. What's not listed here, but is absolutely one that often kicks up in our conversations, is this area of sort of a family office, and how do you deliver family office services to your clients over time. So you're doing more. You may be wondering, do I have enough people? Can I take on this growth? What do I do about this capacity constraint challenge? And by the way, when I talk with organizations, it's probably about a 50-50 split that organizations say, well, we're feeling capacity constrained at the advisor or client facing level of the organization versus the operational area of the organization. There can be tension in both those areas, and it's really kind of a mixed bag in my work with firms in those areas. This is another way that we see the data informing us around capacity. And I know Michael Kitsis and others have done some research on this as well too. But one of the things we've observed is this question of, do we see capacity walls, if you will, show up as organizations grow both in revenue and in headcount? And the answer is yes, we do. It definitely gets a little chunkier, so to speak, when you start seeing those organizations that get to 14 to 16 people. But we do see some pretty pronounced moments in time. Sorry, was there a question? No. We do see moments in time when capacity can really kick up. And so how an organization breaks through that wall, certainly it can vary. Sometimes it's inorganic activity to help break through that, but oftentimes it's about right sizing and scaling the organization, thinking about systems and processes, and quite honestly, growth. How can you grow your way out of it, if you will, is definitely one of the reasons, or one of the ways that we see organizations really tackle this. Interestingly, and this is not just the former COO and me saying this, I suppose it is, but we also went back and looked at when do organizations typically begin adding in, beyond that CEO, some of the COO, some of the other C-suite positions in the organization. And it's definitely begins happening right around here. And that can be a way, depending on what's causing a capacity wall, that these organizations are able to move through that over time. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what we've seen, talent, and then we'll talk about a little bit on the fees and pricing side, and we'll finish up with growth. And we'll definitely take any questions. I guess before we move on to talent, any questions on anything that I've covered so far? All right. Well, feel free to shoot them in the chat. And Kristen, I'll ask you to help me keep track of the chat, because I tend to just keep talking. One of the ways that we see high-performing firms able to break through those capacity walls, navigate a higher number of households per clients, if you will, is in this team structure. One day we may not have to talk about the team structure, but we still need to talk about it. We definitely do see a lot of organizations that haven't quite really moved in that direction, whether it's to deliver and build out a true ensemble practice, or just simply to take care of the existing clients and with the team they've got. We do see this team structure very much come into play with the high-performing firms. And in particular, you can see a slightly heavier weighting as you look at that associate advisor and client service associate. Now, you may have different titles in your business. You heard me talk a few moments ago about the difference between the service and senior. We certainly will see paraplanner, we'll see some other roles, but this is essentially a core client-facing team, if you will, within an organization. And sometimes it's just one of two or three of these. Sometimes it's two or three of these across a single team. You've heard lots of chatter around the house structure and the diamond team structure. I don't really care, as long as it's a structure that really does support what it is you're trying to deliver to your clients. And then as well, and this is a driving factor with these high-performing firms, positions the future growth and opportunity with your team. It allows for future advisors, for example, to move on up through the organization. Interestingly, when we look at compensation, which we're going to talk about in a moment, as a percentage of revenue, it actually is higher for the other firms in our study versus the high-performing firms. That is not to say that high-performing firms are not paying their people more. In fact, they are. But you can see that they've got lower cost positions, are more likely to have more of them versus that senior advisor role, at least initially over time. And there's different ways to approach this, but the punchline on all this is that we do continue to see this being a differentiator and a way that high-performing organizations are able to tackle and handle greater clients over time. This is a heavy slide here, but this is a question we often get. What's happening with these high-performing firms? How are they keeping and developing their talent once they have it? And there's a few that do stand out here. Absolutely, these high-performing organizations are leaning in around what they and articulating, having conversations, even if they don't know exactly how the outcome is going to look, around that expected career journey. This is not going to be new or revolutionary, I hope, for anyone on the call today, but is absolutely a way that these high-performing firms are retaining the people that they most want to retain and absolutely training and developing that future talent of the organization, whether it's on the advisory side, the leadership side, the operational side of the business. I highlighted industry conferences because, there's not a massive difference there, but we do see a little bit of an uptick. And this is really about helping your people find their people. This is an incredible example of that on steroids with the G2 Leadership Institute, but it's equally important in all areas of the business. And so really helping these folks get outside of your four walls and really hear, observe, and learn, absorb what's happening outside with other businesses across the industry can be a powerful educational and development opportunity. And then mentoring is very big. And again, I'm preaching to the choir with this particular group, but this is a very specific effort. So this is not a, hey, I'm going to assign you someone while you're onboarding, or, I'm going to, I'm your manager, your supervisor. This is a true mentor-mentee relationship. It may even be with someone who's not within the business, but these high-performing organizations are more likely to really delve into that, really dig in on that, and champion it across, and quite honestly provide resources for folks on the team to be able to develop mentoring opportunities. So it can sound like basic blocking and tackling, but as you can see, and certainly in our work with firms, not every firm is doing this. And I would offer that even if you're an organization of just 2 or 3 or 4 people, elements of these should absolutely still be in play. I'm working with a firm. I had a call with them just last week. There are 3 people total, and they've got a succession journey that they're on. And they want to act like the firm they want to be one day. And these are elements of some of the things that they're beginning to build out, even with just a few people on the team. So with that, one of the things we also wanted to look at is this difference between, and this is based on how firms reported in the study, high turnover versus low turnover. Do we see any data or relationship with organizations that report what we would consider to be, a relatively low turnover in the organization versus high? And generally speaking, this work from home is still a factor. It's one of the top reasons why in the high performing firms, talent moved, is a lack of alignment with in-office work expectations. It's still a thing. It's hopefully diminishing a little bit over time, if you will, as we continue to settle, but it's still it's still a factor. And we did see with low turnover firms that they are more likely to have virtual team meetings, new technology being implemented. Again, that mentoring is happening. So they're really figuring out ways that even in a virtual environment, if you will, or a flex environment, they're figuring out how to meet the needs of their teams, continue to develop team members, make sure that they are having opportunities to learn, even if you're not necessarily coming into the office every day. And this is really just another example, another illustration of employee attrition. So really important to pay attention to these things, I believe. If you have folks on your team that, you've worked really hard to get them in, they are rock stars today, you want them to be rock stars tomorrow, you've got to pay attention to some of these areas. But we do recognize that there's always going to be a little bit of attrition. Sometimes folks will move, as you can see here, for a career advancing position elsewhere that they feel they've got. But we also do see and recognize that there could be some differences in terms of what's motivating people to move around. You heard me mention a few moments ago that compensation is a bit higher, tends to be a bit higher with the high performing firms. And yet when we look at the top 3 reasons why on talent moves for the high performing firms, we will see compensation equity cited. So in my conversations with these firms, it's not about the dollar amount per se, it's about clarity, it's about path to equity, and it's about understanding how they're going to be measured in their job. And so if those things are not in play, we still see, even with the high performing firms, and we'll see talent moving around for those reasons. So again, things that you can shore up and pay attention to. This delta, the difference between high performing and the other firms in our studies actually shrunk just a little bit. I'm super excited about that. But you can see that still with that, high performing firms tend to have broader ownership. And by that, we mean we see equity in play in these firms, even at the, might even be like a portfolio manager role or something like that, where you wouldn't have seen that traditionally. But having clear criteria as to what it means to own equity is very important there. And that's a lot of the work that we do with these firms that are trying to drive equity as a way to keep the talent they've worked really hard to find. I dropped this in because we always get asked about compensation. It is a major portion of the study that we run. We have 30 to 35 positions that we capture, all myriad of compensation data, including 25th and 75th median, all kinds of data around how firms are playing. We can slice and dice it geographically, all kinds of things like that. But generally speaking, a couple of things stood out to us. The median cash compensation for at that senior advisor and even service advisors, only 3%, really didn't change all that much. But we do continue to see an advent toward an increase of variable comp. So whether it's a specific business development incentive or additional incentive more focused around how the firm does, that whole area is really kicking up. And some of it, I believe, is absolutely in part we'll even say residual, although I don't know that we're fully out of it. But this, as firms are competing for talent, and if you have someone that walks into your office with an offer that's, $40,000, $50,000 more than what they're making currently, assuming that their current pay is at market or competes with the market, that's hard to just automatically increase someone's compensation that much. And so getting very purposeful about the incentive comp, rewarding the behavior that you're looking for, has become an area of focus for these high performing firms. We do see comp increasing on a few roles in particular. And the one that I wanted to call out to you all today is that business development officer role. I think it's a position that has, for lack of a better word, suffered in this industry, but is beginning to really pick up momentum in a lot of the mid to larger firms that we work with. It can be for a couple of reasons. One, they've got great service advisors who maybe are at capacity or don't have the skills to develop business. So having a dedicated BDO is a path to do that. And certainly organizations that we see conducting a lot of M&A are more likely to have BDOs in their businesses as well too, to help drive that branding and really moving the organization forward on the organic side while M&A activity is happening. So we're going to keep an eye on that particular position, but these are ones that we did see a bit of an uptick. And then in terms of compensation, the two that increased the most compensation wise, the two that increased the most headcount wise were the business development officer and that director of client services, which for some organizations could be a precursor to COO role or some additional C-suite over time. So we do see some movement happening on that. And I think it's really important to pay attention to your talent on your team, where you sit on that team even, and what is that? Do you have clarity, as much clarity as possible on what sort of the future path might look like, and particularly as a leader, being willing to have those candid conversations. I'm going to touch for just a few minutes on fees and pricing, and then we're going to go to the growth to finish out our time. Any questions on what I've tackled so far? Any questions on talent? It's a quiet group. All right, let's talk a little bit about fees and pricing. Generally speaking, there's been a lot of chatter out there over the last handful of years, if not more, that we are in a fee compression environment, and we really are not seeing that in our data. I'm going to talk in a few minutes about how firms are pricing and what they're doing in that space. But this is a, a typical sort of standard breakpoint fee structure, if you will. And you can see that generally speaking, there's been an increase in fees over time. So that's good because, as I mentioned, you're doing more for your clients. The cost to deliver is greater to your clients. And so being very purposeful about what it is that you're delivering, the complexity of that, the size of that over time is something that we're certainly keeping an eye on. It's an area that we help organizations think about quite a bit. But what's interesting is when we lay over the high-performing firms, this is one area where there is really not a lot of difference. So we do continue, we're kind of all hanging out in that same band, if you will. But what's interesting to us, and I'll go ahead and load this last screen, this scene is that even with the high-performing firms, we see discounting happening. So when we're approached by an organization, and we've worked with several of them this year, and Stevens, I know, worked with a couple as well, on their fees and pricing. What are they charging? Is it right? And if they need to make a change, how do they go about doing that? One of the ways that we see some organizations taking having a meaningful impact on right-sizing their pricing is by simply not discounting. Stop the discounting, if you will, and having a process internally that if an advisor or a leader in the business who's talking to a prospective client wants to have some sort of concession, and sometimes concessions are absolutely appropriate, but there's a process internally that they have to go through. It's amazing how that develops a level of fortitude with advisors when they're sitting in front of a prospect if they think they have to pitch the explanation, if you will, to a leadership team. But really thinking about are we discounting and how can we reduce that over time is really critical. And one of the questions we often get is, okay, well, if I change my fees, which by the way, only about 17% of firms in our study said that they changed their fees and pricing. So this is not something that is happening, broadly across our study. That number is fairly consistent. We do still continue to see about a 25 to 27% movement annually toward hybrid pricing. So there's what you're charging and how you're charging. And with the how, we do continue to see a little bit of movement on. But for organizations who change fees, the question often is, what's this going to mean for my client retention? And you can see in the same year as the fee change, according to our data, whether they lowered or whether they raised, which it was about a 50-50 split in our study this year, you see a pretty even similar retention rate is very much in play. With that in mind, why are firms changing their fees? And you can see some interest, the cost to deliver businesses remaining competitive. Honestly, I've worked with a few firms this year where their fee structure is so low, and it's been an area it's a way that they believe they've competed for business in the past, but is actually working against them. And I'm not even talking about working against them from a profitability fiscal standpoint. I'm referring to just clients now, prospects now are kind of like, really? Like I have a level of understanding about fees and your fee is really, really low. Why is that? What am I not getting? What am I giving up? So being very mindful about the fees and pricing being a little bit too low as well. We worked with an organization in the Midwest, a very large firm, to change their fees this year. To say that they prepared carefully would be an understatement. It was a couple years worth of work working through this. You certainly don't want to change fees haphazardly. And the number one question that they got when advisors began to call their top clients and talk to them about how their fees were going to change was, what was I paying before? And again, that's not a reason to be casual or flippant about adjusting fees, but just know that, anticipating and changing fees, clients may, the second one was, you're not going anywhere? Okay, cool, we're happy. So, just really thinking about what do fees and pricing mean within your organization. And many of you on the call today may not be in a position to directly influence the overall fees and pricing structure of your business. But it's an area that as you do think about the kinds of clients you're bringing in, the cost to deliver the services to them over time, it can be an important question. And then when we looked in subsequent year as well, right? So it's one thing to think about, did we lose clients the year we implemented the change? Do we lose clients in subsequent years? And you can see it's pretty even across the board, pretty high, pretty level with our general retention rates. So if done the right way, and we've got some resources that we make available to clients to help them think about this, it's something that they can see. But the impact over time can be meaningful. And so this is an example of what happened in that year of the change, the following year versus that prior year, and what they were able to do from a revenue standpoint. Again, for a number of organizations, it's as simple as just stop discounting. Stand by your value prop, know it, own it, value it, state it, and don't discount it. Is kind of what we'll probably get t-shirts made with all that on there. Any questions on fees and pricing before we go to channels of growth and finish out our time? All right. Okay, so growth. You saw the numbers. And I know Philip and you as a group have talked about this a lot. And we see this even in the Schwab study, for example. Lisa Salvi and I have talked about this. Organic growth is absolutely, really still a challenge for many organizations. And when we talk about growth with businesses, it's really important. I always absolutely preface it by saying, you know, whether you're looking to be 10 times bigger than you are today, or just simply to stay ahead of the natural headwinds that are coming at your business. Number one reason for losing clients, death. The markets may not cooperate all the time. I know it's hard to imagine, but sometimes that's the case. Maybe you've had to make investments in your business and that you need to keep that growth mechanism, that growth engine moving in order to stay in front of that. So however you define growth, it's something that we've been looking at carefully. We've been thinking about all the different channels, and I want to share with you some of the data that we've seen as we look back, particularly looking back just the last few years, if you will. So these are the primary channels of growth that we capture year over year in our global advisor study. And you can see, not surprisingly, that most firms as a percentage are growing through existing clients and COIs. Now, I would submit to you that the case could potentially be made that it's the lack of growth in some of these other channels, which we're going to talk about in a moment, that make that percentage look so much bigger. And that when you really look at the hard numbers of how many actual clients did you get from existing clients, the number is really not that big. And in fact, when we look at firms that have participated in both Global Advisor and Global Investor, and we see in Global Investor that their clients, you know, super high NPS, lots of promoters. They say, not only am I willing to refer, which is what NPS is all about, they will say, I have referred. And then we look at the data in the Global Advisor study, and those numbers do not add up. And we have what we call a referral gap. And that's that gap in between what your clients say they have done and what's actually showing up in your business. A primary factor in that is when we ask your clients, how did you make that referral? Passing your name along is the number one way that they referred you. It's the most passive way. And so when we see organizations get purposeful about educating clients on, if you know someone that you'd like us to talk to that could benefit from, you know, help us deliver this value to them, choose better words than I, you know, educate them on a great way to make that happen versus that, hey, I passed your name along. So getting purposeful about those things are ways that we can close that gap over time. But as we move through this list, I've given you a few minutes to kind of look at it in a little bit more detail. A couple of things that I wanted to call out to you. COIs are, of course, an important part of that. There's an opportunity there. We do see, as you can see here on the median new client size, that and this has been the case for several years, that referrals from COIs tend to be bigger than referrals that come from clients. So something to think about. The one that I am particularly interested in watching as we go, especially into our 2025 study, is this advisor channel. So who is that? What is that? That is a specific channel of growth where the advisors have developed their own network. They're out there. They're not relying on existing clients to make a referral and introduction. They really are building out their own local network and opportunities within their communities or through other avenues. And it's been really great to see this number begin to tick up. It's an indicator to us that investments are being made in making sure that these advisors have capacity to go do this, but also have the skills to do this over time, right? And that they can really delve in on that and build out their own networks of business over time. Really, really important. And then, of course, on the digital marketing, we get asked a lot about this as well. This is one that we continue to keep an eye on. In our study next year, we're actually going to break this down just a little bit because digital marketing is kind of a big bucket. It's everything from your digital storefront to LinkedIn posts, podcasts, all kinds of avenues, if you will. But it is an area that we see kind of hanging out for organizations. And in fact, even at our recent practice management symposium, we did a full afternoon breakout session for our attendees on driving some of these other channels aside from the client referral piece, and really thinking about other ways to build this up. You can see certainly as a percentage that custodial network is not a huge driver. It is absolutely a channel for many organizations, as are events, and you can see the corresponding median size of clients that we've gotten from those. So lots of opportunities here. A long-standing characteristic of the faster growing firms in our study is that they are pursuing multiple channels of growth. They are not simply relying on a client referral or even COIs for that matter. And there are some firms that have really amazing COI growth engines in play, if you will, but they are absolutely thinking about other channels and making investments within their organization toward that.
Hey, Catherine.
Yeah.
Natalie here has a question around how much are firms allocating towards marketing and what are high-performing firms doing in terms of the spend here.
Yeah. Not enough. Okay. As a percentage of revenue, when we look at it in our income statement, we continue to see the spend on marketing. And by that, I mean any effort toward marketing and branding, not counting headcount. So set your CMO, your BDO, your marketing associate, set your human capital aside. All the other components continue to hang out in that 3.5% to 4.5% of revenue range. We might see an uptick in a year where a firm is doing something unique, but generally speaking, it's hung out there. With that said, we are seeing more dedicated headcount being added to organizations. And so I'm looking forward to in 2025, perhaps backing into a number that incorporates some of that headcount so you can see what that looks like over time. Because obviously for some organizations, the investment in marketing is in the form of, hey, we're going to hire somebody who's tackling this, if you will. Stephen, anything you would add on that?
No, I think that's right. What's interesting is when we look at, we do the regression on if they're growing faster, is it because of marketing or not, and it's always noisy and there's not a clear correlation there that we see. So
I had an opportunity.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say whatever Natalie's working on looks really interesting. So I'm curious whatever project that is. It looks cool.
I want to know more too. I want to know more as well. Yeah, and I as someone who sat in RA firms, and particularly as a COO, there's always this question of like, if I spend money on this, like how do I connect that spend with, sponsoring an event or something like that with, directly getting new clients in the door. And one way that I would encourage you to consider this is this idea that, particularly if most of your growth is coming from client referrals, right? So you know that it was Patty that referred Sue to your business. So it's not a matter of, hey, how did you hear about us? But I think a question you can ask is, what are all the ways you checked us out? And really getting an understanding of, this idea where prospective clients, even when they come to you in the most warm way possible, what are all the ways that they may have checked out the organization, checked out you? That can help inform where you might spend some of those dollars, if you will. And I would submit that if they go to look elsewhere or check out the firm, check you out, understand what does this firm's presence in our community look like, and they don't see anything, that could work against you. So it's, it can definitely be tricky. And I know Philip has some very specific thoughts around how to go about this. But generally speaking, I'd love to see that spend as a percentage of revenue go up, generally speaking, across our study. So we'll be the first to let you know if that happens for sure. So with that in mind, at the end of the day, growth comes down to a few core components for us. And this is really to give you a little bit of insight of how do we, take the data, which is interesting, and start translating it into activity? How do we start actually driving growth in the organization? Now, bear in mind that that answering that question for us is usually at least 6 to 10 hours of work with an advisory team to really delve into that. So I'm going to give you a super high level framework and some ways to think about that before we close out our time. But this is really where we start. So you've got to have these core components in play, and then you have to have the implementation in process, or excuse me, implementation ready to go, right? The two things have to go hand in hand. And this is why for a lot of organizations, they may have incredible clarity on who they most want to work with. They might even have good avenues or vehicles for filling that pipeline, but the structure of the business is jammed up right now. You are out of capacity. You don't have the technology in play to help you really scale up the growth that you want to achieve. So these things absolutely have to go hand in hand. But the one that I wanted to highlight just really briefly in our time is this target client profile. And depending on the size of your organization and different advisors you have, it could certainly be more than one profile. But firms who get incredibly purposeful about this, they think about who they want to work with, and which is, essentially a client segmentation, if you will, and then the service model, right? What are we going to do for them, which really kicks in that other side of that bond. But I wanted to just throw this out to you just for a little bit of fun as you do think about building out, revisiting and refining your target client profile. So we talk about demographics, really, really important, but the psychographics of who you want to work with is equally important in our opinion. And it's an area that through our global investor study, we've really been helping organizations dig in around the behaviors and the values and the things that ultimately drive the clients you most want to work with. If we were live in a room, I would ask you, how many of you have clients you do not want to replicate? Usually most everybody puts their hand in the air. So this is about getting purposeful, even as you're going after that client referral piece as well. But if we had someone who was born in 1948, a male, raised in the UK, married a couple of times, lives in a castle, who could we be speaking of? And I won't ask necessarily for answers. I was going to ask everybody to hop into their chat, but we won't do that today. But this may be someone, some still say Prince Charles, but he is king right now. So King Charles very much comes to mind. But this is also the demographics of someone else. And when you start thinking about the differences between how you would take care of a King Charles versus an Ozzy Osbourne, you may decide, I only want Ozzy Osbourne clients. I don't want King Charles clients. But understanding their drivers, their values, their behaviors is really where we see target client profiles come to life and really serve the businesses, the organizations that are using them. So even if you're sitting here today thinking, we've got a pretty good target client profile, you can go to our website, you can see, which hopefully it says something more than we work with, professionals and retirees, something a little more succinct than that, or a little more distinct than that, I should say is the better word. Thinking about the behavioral pieces as well and the psychographic pieces is where we see those ideal target client profiles really get dialed up in the businesses we work with. I'm going to close out, and then I'll close out my screen in a moment here, and we can open it up for a little bit of Q&A. But again, in the spirit of, we've given you a lot of data. We've backed up on around a lot of topics. So this is kind of a little checklist. You are going to get this deck at the end of our time today. But these are some questions that you can either take back for your own goal setting and some of the work that you're thinking about for 2025, or even within your larger team. Don't hesitate to reach out if we can add any additional explanation. But thinking about that capacity piece is really important. And not just the capacity you need for the next 6 months or 12 months, but the capacity you may need for the next 3 to 5 years, depending on what your goals and objectives are. For sure, thinking about that growth piece is equally important as well. Additional resource for you, this is available to any and all, is the Managing Your Practice podcast. You can see Philip's podcast, which is actually continues to be a top 10 podcast for us. This podcast series turned 4 years old last year. We do a podcast per month, and this is just a sampling of the more recent ones that we've released. So just as an additional resource for you all. And then the last thing I want to encourage you before I unsave my screen, as we turn our attention to a new year, we've been talking here about your own what information or ways that you're thinking about driving your business forward in 2025, your own professional development as well. But if you spend any time with me, or if you saw my social media, you would know that traveling is something that is really near and dear to my heart. I believe it is critical for health and wellness and well-being. That is a session that Stephen hosted at our Practice Management Symposium. It is coming up more and more with clients. They want to talk about not just their financial well-being, but their health and wellness well-being. And that podcast actually is coming out this month, a conversation we had with a couple of advisors. And I am an avid traveler. And one of the things that I love is when I get to go to Italy, I never get tired. When I land in Florence and I come around the corner, normally I would ask, who can name what this building is? But what I love about the Duomo, the Santa Maria del Fiore, is that it took over 140 years to build. But they did not know at the time they began building it how to construct this dome. And so I think it's inspirational. And as you do think about 2025, be less worried necessarily about having answers to everything you want to accomplish in 2025 and beyond. Just start building. And so with that, I will unshare my screen and happy to take any questions.
We had some come in on the chat here. Charles asks, do you find that firms have the capacity to actually take on and service new clients? And can you explain the lack of spending? Because we mentioned capacity challenges earlier. So that's one, and then I'll jump to Chris's here for that.
So let me make sure I understand the first part of the question. How are organizations tackling the capacity needed to service clients once they bring them on board? Did I interpret that?
I believe so.
Let me
Charles, if you
explain
want
it. Yeah, no worries. This is Charles. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
My question was specifically, we mentioned a lack of spending towards marketing, and I was wondering if the reason why there's not spending is because of that capacity issue that we mentioned before. Is that the reason why we probably don't have as much spending as we think we should have?
Yeah, I do think that's a factor. It's not something we've formally measured in our study, but I do, in my conversations with organizations, I do think it's a factor. I mean, I was talking to a firm the other day. They have not been able to get back to people that have been referred to their firm by existing clients. I mean, that just made me want to breathe into a brown paper bag, because now you're jeopardizing the client experience in addition to, but they just don't have any capacity. So they've had to put a moratorium on taking on new clients, which again, also is problematic. So if you're trying to stem that, I could see where you would say, well, let's stop putting our name out there. That's a rough position to be in over time, but I would not be surprised if that's a factor. It's a great question.
Then Chris had a question around the 3.5%. He sounds high. Is there any guideline or takeaway on the right amount?
Oh,
And I'll tell you that the reason for that question, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
The reason for that question is we've kind of seen other benchmarking studies where it's like 1.3%. And that number that you mentioned was pretty shocking. I'm like, that's way off of what we were thinking. So yeah, I was just curious. It sounded like you thought that number was low, the 3.5. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, first of all, to bear in mind that we're talking about a percentage of revenue, right? So depending on the size and scope of the organization, 3% could be a relatively small number. It could be a relatively big number. I think what's most important and what we're trying to do with the firms we work with is, where's the best place for you as an organization to spend those dollars, right? I mentioned earlier that high-performing firms in particular tend to be pursuing multiple channels of growth, but this does not mean that they feel like they have to be everywhere. So let's take the digital landscape, for example. It's easier than ever to be in a lot of different areas of the digital landscape, but you still have to have a strategy, and you still have to know where are the clients that we most want to work with? Where are the referral opportunities that we most want to gain? Where are they? And let's go there. Let's be purposeful about that. So I think it's more important when we work with firms to focus on what's your strategy, and then we can back into the numbers, if you will. Also recognizing that some organizations will outsource or use some of that percentage to in lieu of perhaps maybe a headcount, a human capital piece in their organization over time. One of the things we're looking at, I don't have the data here today, is when do organizations, for example, start purposely adding not just that, we'll even set business development officer aside, because that's not for everybody, but true, marketing associate, all the way up to potentially a CMO? And do we see any patterns in what that does relative to that spending over time? I don't have that data, but it's an area that we're asking similar questions around. But it's really about getting purposeful about who you most want to work with, where are they out there in the world, so to speak, and develop that strategy. Even when I talk with incredibly well-known marketing strategists or outside organizations that do this work exclusively with advisors, that's where they start. And so then when you do spend those dollars, you feel like you're doing it in a very purposeful way. But I do think that probably that needs to be a slightly higher percentage. And I know for a fact that in some of the other studies, it's much lower. So you're right.
Do we have other questions from folks? Anyone can jump on in, either unmute or through chat.
I have a question that I'm not sure if I'm going to position this totally correctly, but as I'm thinking about the recruiting and retention, challenge that I think we're all starting to hear. I mean, we hear a lot about it over the last year, especially of our senior staff, senior advisors. Do you have a sense how much of that comes? I mean, do you think much of that is coming from transactions that are occurring in the industry? Or is it from other things, a bunch of things? Do you have a sense?
M&A activity is absolutely having an impact on talent moving around, talent retention, and even development for that matter. And it's something that as we make the turn into 2025 with some of our surveys and studies, looking to understand a little bit more of. And I don't have the numbers in front of me. I can send this in follow up to Kristen, but I did recently see some data, some research that McKinsey has done around just the sheer, even the movement of client assets and what and how much of that is being caused by advisors are moving. So if it's one thing for talent to move, but then when clients are moving around as well too, and that's an extension of that, if you will. But M&A activity for sure. I mean, let's be honest. I'll be honest. I've taken phone calls from advisors that were part of a firm that sold to another organization, and that was not what they wanted. They, for whatever reason, were not on board with that, and so wanted to make a change, did not want to be locked into that new organization, that new merged entity, if you will. So it's absolutely triggering it at all levels of an organization. Certainly where there is redundancy on the operational or support side of the organization, that can be a factor for talent moving around. Usually in our work and when we're having conversations with firms for those roles, hopefully the first glance is, these are great people. Maybe we find a different seat on the bus for them, but we still want them on the bus, right? So it's a process, and we do see talent moving around as a result of the M&A activity for sure. Is that helpful?
That was great. Yeah, thank you so much. I think this has all been really helpful. Yeah.
Good.
Catherine, we did have another question come in. Kent was asking if you can explain the role, the business developer officer. Are they managing the pipeline in addition to doing biz dev, or is it like more to the role? What would that look like?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a really lovely consulting answer. It depends. But what I would say, we do see a few things coming forth. First of all, there is a base salary associated with the business development officer role. And usually it's because they're being asked to shepherd some of the core marketing, branding, be a good steward, be a good corporate steward, right? A member of the team, if you will. And so base compensation kind of sets the tone and expectations around that. And certainly their ultimate compensation is much more variable, if you will. And it can vary in terms of where that BDO is focused. It could be straight up, they are filling the pipeline, and then their job, and I think this is actually a pretty interesting aspect for larger firms, is to help identify who's going to be the right advisor for that prospective client, right? Really taking the time to make sure there's a good match there, if you will. That can absolutely be a role for some of the larger firms of business development officers. But a lot of it is that getting out there, whether it's, custodial referral network in the community, building out networks, supporting those advisors to really build out their own networks over time. And then, of course, if they identify prospective clients, they get paid for that for sure, for closing that business, bringing that business in. So there can be a bit of a span to that. We're looking to hopefully over time maybe have a couple of additional roles in our compensation headcount part of our study that delineate a little bit more as to where that BDO is spending their time. But it's kind of a mixed bag right now.
I maybe give you one follow-up because we just have some internal discussion about how to comp this. So we do the salary, we have somebody in a BD role. They should be ultimately, I agree, probably making more of their comp on the introduction of the client in. I mean, what do you see firms paying? Do you pay that 1 year? Do you pay that over several years? What do you think from your consultant answer is the kind of the best way to do it? Because I don't know that we've got it 100% delineated correctly, and we're just always to try to figure out how you keep margins intact and do it the way you want.
Yeah, I don't know what is the ultimate right or versus wrong, but I will tell you from the data in our study that predominantly the business development incentive, whether it's being earned by a business development officer or a senior advisor, for example, typically is based on first year revenue only, based on a percentage. It's kind of hung out in that 25 to 28% payout range. For most years with our high performing firms, it can get as high as the mid 30s, but it's most predominantly based on first year revenue only, one and done, if you will, and move on from there. Every once in a while, we'll see maybe a 2 or 3 trail, but I not as often as we see the first year rev only.
All right.
All right.
Any final questions? Great. Well, Catherine, thank you so much. This was wonderful. We greatly appreciate you taking your time and sharing this with us. Everyone, we will follow up later today, sharing the slides, and looking forward to staying connected with you all later this year and hope again to see you next year as well. So thank you all. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out with any questions or feedback or things you'd like to hear in these future meetings, or even if you would like to present as well. We'd love to have that as well. So please stay connected with us. And again, thank you, Catherine, so much.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone.
Great job, Catherine. Bye.
Thank you.